Hayabusa hung beside a small asteroid called Itokawa, and from a distance, the mission looked as though it had already crossed the finish line. The spacecraft had traveled across millions of miles of space to reach a destination no sample return mission had ever visited before. Below it drifted an oddly shaped world of rock and rubble. Hayabusa's job was simple to describe and extraordinarily difficult to accomplish. Touch the asteroid, collect material, and bring it home. By the time those operations began, it was easy to believe the hardest part was over. The asteroid was no longer a distant target. It filled cameras and instruments. Maneuvers had been completed. Contact had been maintained. The spacecraft was preparing for the journey that would make history. All it had to do now was return. That assumption would not survive for long. Near Itokawa, Hayabusa attempted its sampling operations and prepared for departure. Questions remained about exactly what had happened during collection, but the mission still appeared alive. The spacecraft still existed. Earth was still waiting. Then the spacecraft lost control. A fuel leak triggered a chain of consequences that spread through the mission like a crack spreading through glass. Hayabusa began tumbling. The careful orientation required to operate a spacecraft vanished. Antennas no longer pointed where they should. Power systems struggled. Communication became uncertain. Then the signal disappeared. The image of Hayabusa beside the asteroid suddenly changed meaning. Moments earlier, it had looked like a spacecraft preparing for the trip home. Now, it looked like a machine stranded beyond rescue. Distance had not changed. The asteroid was still there. The route home still existed. But a route home means very little when nobody can talk to the spacecraft traveling along it. For a time, survival itself became the mission. The question was no longer whether Hayabusa had collected anything. The question was whether Hayabusa still existed in any useful form at all. Then, a faint answer arrived. Communication returned. Not fully, not cleanly, not in a way that erased what had happened. But the silence ended. Hayabusa was still out there.
Began to falter.
At first, that seemed like the turning point. Contact had been restored. The spacecraft had survived. Perhaps the crisis was ending. Instead, the story revealed its central contradiction. Recovery did not restore the spacecraft. Recovery exposed new damage. Hayabusa could communicate again, but it was no longer the spacecraft that had arrived at Itokawa. Systems had been compromised. Operational flexibility had shrunk. Capabilities that once existed could no longer be assumed. The mission had escaped one failure, only to discover the consequences waiting behind it. A traveler who regains consciousness after an accident is alive. That does not mean they can stand. Hayabusa now faced a similar reality. The spacecraft was still moving through space. The question was whether it remained capable of moving toward Earth. Gradually, the answer became yes. But it was a fragile yes. The return journey began. Far behind the spacecraft, Itokawa became smaller. Far ahead, Earth remained almost unimaginably distant. Between them stretched years of travel and a growing list of damaged systems. The audience expectation of a recovery story starts to break here. Normally, survival leads toward strength. Hayabusa survived and became weaker. The spacecraft continued home using ion engines designed to provide gentle thrust over long periods. Those engines became the next narrowing path. An anomaly appeared. Then another challenge. Restoration efforts kept portions of the propulsion system functioning, but each solution seemed to consume part of the margin that remained. The spacecraft was moving, Yet movement itself became the source of suspense. How much capability was enough? Nobody needed Hayabusa to become healthy again. The spacecraft only needed to remain functional slightly longer than its remaining distance required. That distinction changed everything. Every successful correction preserved the mission while reducing future options. Every repaired capability carried a cost. Every month of forward progress depended on systems that no longer inspired complete confidence. The shrinking options pattern became visible. Communication had vanished and returned. Control had vanished and partially returned. Propulsion capability had weakened and been restored in limited ways. Each recovery kept the mission alive. Each recovery also revealed how little redundancy remained. Years passed. Earth slowly grew larger. The spacecraft slowly became more fragile. Normally, those trends move in opposite directions. A vehicle approaching success becomes safer. Hayabusa approached success, while its remaining pathways narrowed. The destination drew closer. The margin for error kept shrinking. Eventually, the planet that had once been a distant point became a visible destination. Australia waited beneath the projected return path. One final task remained. The return capsule had to separate. Everything now depended on a piece of hardware far smaller than the spacecraft that carried it. This was the last remaining opportunity. The mission no longer required Hayabusa itself to survive. It only required the final piece to survive. As Earth approached, the spacecraft and capsule entered the closing moments of a journey that had repeatedly seemed finished. Not completed. Finished. Lost. Over. Yet the mission continued. Then came the separation. The capsule began its descent toward Earth. Above it, the parent spacecraft followed a different fate. As the atmosphere rushed upward, Hayabusa burned. The machine that had crossed interplanetary space reached an asteroid, lost control, lost contact, recovered, weakened, recovered again, and spent years crawling home, disappeared into fire. The spacecraft did not make it back. At least not in the ordinary sense. But below that streak of light, the capsule continued descending. The image captured the entire contradiction of the mission. The carrier was dying. The mission was surviving. The capsule landed in the Australian desert near Woomera. Recovery teams reached it. The final uncertainty remained unopened for a little while longer. Had Hayabusa actually brought anything home? The answer arrived later. Inside were particles identified as material from Itokawa. The mission had succeeded. Not because the failures vanished. Not because the spacecraft recovered completely. Not because every system worked as intended. It succeeded because every failure left behind one remaining path. Back at the asteroid, Hayabusa had looked like a spacecraft completing its greatest challenge. In hindsight, that was the moment the real challenge began. The journey home became a long process of losing capabilities while preserving possibility. A wounded machine crossed the distance anyway. And in the final image, a capsule drifted down through Earth's sky, while the spacecraft that carried it burned overhead. The machine did not fully survive. The mission did.